A stranger slipped the CEO a warning, "Don't drink it. Leave now." He looked up just in time to see her disappear into the crowd. The ballroom of the Waldorf in Manhattan shimmered with opulence. Golden chandeliers hung like crowns above a sea of tuxedos and crystal glasses. It was the kind of night where fortunes were celebrated and secrets stayed buried. Billionaire Julian Crosswell stood at the center of it all, unaware that his next sip could end everything. But fate had other plans, and her name was Mara Ellis. What began as a whisper in chaos would soon become a story of danger, destiny, and a love no one saw coming. Mara Ellis had done this job for months. Quiet corners, polite smiles, and long hours no one noticed. That night at the Manhattan Gala, she was restocking towels near the men's lounge when two men walked in, talking just loud enough for trouble. She wasn't the kind of person who eavesdropped, but when one of them mentioned a name, Julian Crosswell, her focus snapped. Then came the words that froze her. "The champagne will take care of him before midnight." Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She stayed still, pretending to fold a towel, while the men passed right behind her and left the corridor. She waited, counting to 5, trying to convince herself she hadn't really heard that, but she knew she had. The whisper of danger wouldn't leave her head. When she stepped back toward the main hallway, her eyes caught something that made her stomach twist. Across the ballroom, she saw a waiter hand Julian a single glass of champagne, the same drink those men had mentioned. Her pulse spiked. Fear turned into action before she could think. She scanned for a way to reach him without drawing attention. Her gaze landed on a nearby serving station, and in a rush of impulse, she grabbed a tray filled with drinks and stepped forward as if she belonged there. The lights seemed blinding as she crossed the room. Every step felt heavier, her breath shallow, her heartbeat louder than the music. When she finally reached him, he looked down at her with calm curiosity, the kind, powerful men carry without realizing it. She leaned just close enough for her voice to reach him through the noise. "Don't drink that," she whispered, eyes locking with his for the first time. He didn't react right away, but in that single second, something between fear and fate passed through both of them. The moment the words left her mouth, Mara felt her body go cold. Julian hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. She didn't wait to see if he believed her. She just kept walking, blending back into the crowd before anyone could question why a staff member was whispering to a billionaire. Her mind replayed what she'd heard in that hallway, every word echoing like a heartbeat. It hadn't been gossip, it was a plan. She wasn't supposed to know, and now she wasn't supposed to exist. As she slipped through the side corridor, she caught her reflection in a mirror, pale, shaking, terrified, the kind of fear that feels like it could crawl out of your skin. She tried to calm down, reminding herself that maybe he'd take her warning seriously, maybe it was enough. But something told her it wasn't. People like that didn't joke about murder. They had resources, reach, and people who cleaned up their messes quietly. In the ballroom, Julian stared at the untouched glass on the table. Around him, laughter continued, but his instincts screamed that something had shifted. He remembered the look in her eyes. Pure panic, not performance. He pretended to mingle, thanked a few guests, and excused himself toward the back of the room. Something in his gut told him he needed to find her. Fast. Back near the lounge, Mara was already realizing how badly she'd miscalculated. 2 security men were questioning the catering staff, and one of the waiters pointed toward her direction. She didn't know who saw what, but she knew someone had noticed her approaching Julian. Her stomach dropped. Whoever was behind this already knew she'd said something. She glanced at the exit. Heart racing. She had no plan. But she was sure of one thing. If she didn't leave now, she might never leave at all. Mara froze when she noticed the 2 security guards moving through the hallway. One of them was already asking the catering staff about a young woman with a tray. Her chest tightened as she realized they were talking about her. She took a step back, ready to run, when a familiar voice spoke quietly from behind. "Don't move," Julian said, his tone low but steady. She turned, startled, and saw him standing in the narrow light of the corridor. Before she could say a word, Julian reached for her hand. "They're looking for you," he said. "Come with me." She didn't understand how he knew, but the way he said it left no room for argument. He led her down the side passage, their footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Her mind raced. She was just a cleaning girl, and now she was running beside one of the most powerful men in New York. It felt unreal, terrifying, and strangely safe all at once. They turned a corner and slipped through a staff-only door, just as one of the guards called out behind them. Julian didn't stop until they reached a back elevator. He pressed the button, his jaw tense. his hand still holding hers. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of her breathing and the distant hum of music from the Gala. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But if they find you here," he cut her off softly, "then it's already too late for both of us." When the elevator doors closed, silence filled the space. Mara's pulse hammered in her ears, her fear colliding with something she couldn't name, the warmth of his touch, the strange trust in his eyes. She looked up at him, searching for some kind of reassurance. Julian didn't look away. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "But now you need to let me protect you." The doors opened again, and just like that, her old life ended in the blink of an eye. The elevator doors opened into the quiet parking level, the echo of their footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. Mara hesitated, unsure if following him was bravery or madness. "Where are we going?" she asked, still catching her breath. Julian didn't slow down. "Somewhere they won't find you," he replied. There was something about the way he said it, controlled but laced with fear, that made her trust him more than logic should allow. They reached a black sedan parked near the far corner. Julian unlocked it quickly, motioning for her to get in. "Please," he said softly. And it wasn't an order, it was concern. Mara slid into the passenger seat, still trembling. As the doors closed, the noise of the city vanished, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat. She stared at him, finally daring to ask, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know if I'm telling the truth." Julian met her eyes. "Because you didn't look like a liar. You looked terrified." His words caught her off guard. No one had ever read her that easily. She turned toward the window, trying to hide the heat rising in her face. "I heard two men talking," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "They said something about you not surviving the toast. I didn't even think, I just told you not to drink." Julian's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. "But if they saw you talk to me, they won't let it go." Mara swallowed, realizing he was right. Every minute they stayed in that hotel, the danger grew. She looked at him again, really looked this time. The sharp suit, the calm eyes hiding 1,000 thoughts, the quiet strength in his voice. He wasn't the man from the headlines. He was human, and he was afraid too. "So, what happens now?" she asked quietly. Julian started the engine, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, "I make sure you stay alive." Julian drove in silence for several blocks, the weight of the situation settling over them like fog. The streets outside glowed with city lights, but inside the car, everything felt still. Mara stared down at her shaking hands, realizing the full gravity of what she'd done. "They'll come after me, won't they?" she asked quietly. Julian hesitated before answering. "They might already be looking." He glanced at her, his voice steady but softer now. "But I won't let anything happen to you." Mara turned to look at him, searching for any sign of doubt. She didn't find any, just that same quiet intensity she'd seen in the ballroom. It unnerved her how calm he seemed, how composed. "You don't even know me," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Julian's lips curved in a faint, tired smile. "I know courage when I see it." The words landed deeper than he intended. For a brief second, something like warmth filled the small space between them. In the rearview mirror, Julian caught sight of a dark SUV following a few cars behind. He didn't say anything at first, but the sudden change in his expression made Mara notice. "What is it?" she asked, tension rising in her voice. "Stay calm," he murmured. "Just hold on." He took the next corner sharply, weaving through traffic with precision that betrayed experience. Mara gripped the seatbelt, her pulse racing. Fear and trust collided in her chest, leaving her breathless. After several turns, the SUV finally disappeared from sight. Julian exhaled, the first real sign of relief since the ballroom. He parked the car in an underground garage and turned to face her. "From now on, you do exactly as I say. No detours, no contact with anyone." Mara nodded, still catching her breath. For the first time she saw something new in his eyes, not the control of a CEO, but the quiet fear of a man who knew exactly how close danger was, and somehow that made her feel less alone. They reached an older building on the east side of Manhattan, far from the skyline that usually surrounded men like Julian Crosswell. The place was quiet, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. Anonymous, safe. Julian parked in the private garage below and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mara's nerves were shot. Her voice barely came out. "You have a place here?" He nodded once. Somewhere no one would think to look. His calmness didn't match the storm behind his eyes. Inside, the narrow corridor smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Mara hesitated by the elevator, trying to process everything that had just happened. "You shouldn't have helped me," she said quietly. "Now you're part of it." Julian gave a small shrug, pressing the button. "I was already part of it long before you showed up." His tone was firm, but there was a crack of weariness behind it, like someone who'd been carrying secrets too long. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped in beside him, still unsure why she trusted him. When they reached the top floor, Julian unlocked the door to a small apartment, nothing like the luxury penthouse she imagined a billionaire would own. It was simple, almost normal. Books, a couch, dim lighting. Mara stood by the entrance, her arms crossed tightly. "I can't stay here," she said. "You don't owe me anything." He turned to her, closing the distance slightly. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "That's not something I forget." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her more than the danger itself. For the first time since that night began, the silence between them felt different. Not tense, but heavy, with something unspoken. She could feel his gaze, steady but careful, like he was trying not to scare her. "You need to rest," he said finally. "You'll think clearer in the morning." Mara nodded, though she knew she wouldn't sleep. As Julian walked away to make a call, she glanced around the room again. It didn't feel like a hideout. It felt like the start of something she couldn't name yet. Julian hung up his phone, his expression serious but composed. "I have someone checking the security footage from the Gala," he said. "If they were watching you, we'll know soon." Mara sat on the couch, knees pulled close, still replaying every second of the night in her head. "They were right behind me," she whispered. "If you hadn't shown up." She didn't finish. Julian looked at her then. Really looked, and for a second, the businessman faded, replaced by someone real, someone who cared. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I promise." She nodded, though fear still lingered like static in the air. "You make promises too easily," she murmured, half to herself. He let out a soft breath, half amusement, half exhaustion. "You'd be surprised how many I've kept." He sat down across from her, keeping just enough distance to respect the space she clearly needed. "Tell me everything you heard," he continued, his voice calm, steady. "Every detail matters." Mara recounted the conversation word for word, and with each line, Julian's jaw tightened. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, hands clasped. "It confirms what I suspected," he said finally. "Someone inside my company is dirty. I've been collecting evidence quietly for months, but I didn't realize how far they'd go." Mara stared at him, disbelief mixing with concern. "So, this isn't just about you?" Julian shook his head. "No, it's about what I found, and who's willing to kill to bury it." His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. The silence that followed was almost intimate, filled with adrenaline and something softer neither of them could explain. "What do we do now?" Mara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Julian met her gaze, his own full of quiet resolve. "We leave the city for a few days," he said, "somewhere off the radar. I'll handle the rest." She wanted to argue, but his voice carried the kind of certainty that made fear feel smaller. For the first time that night, Mara realized she wasn't just running anymore. She was running with him. They left Manhattan just before sunrise, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror like ghosts of a world that no longer felt safe. Julian drove in silence, one hand steady on the wheel, while the other tapped nervously against his leg. Mara sat beside him, watching the skyline disappear, trying to make sense of how she'd gone from folding towels to being hunted. "Do you really think they'll follow us?" she finally asked. Julian glanced her way, his voice calm but heavy. "If they think you know too much, yes." The miles passed quietly. Every now and then, Julian checked the mirrors, his expression tightening. Mara couldn't read him. He was composed, but there was something deeper beneath the surface. "You don't seem scared," she said softly. He gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been living with fear longer than I'd like to admit." It stopped surprising me. The honesty in his tone caught her off guard. She realized then that his confidence wasn't arrogance, it was armor. When they finally stopped at a small cabin near the Hudson River, Mara stepped out first, breathing in the cold air. It was quiet here. Too quiet, but somehow comforting. Julian joined her, setting his phone aside and locking the car. "We'll stay here for a bit," he said. "No cameras, no eyes." She looked at him, noticing how tired he seemed. "You do this often? Run from people who want you dead?" He let out a short, dry laugh. "Not usually with company." Inside the cabin, the tension slowly melted into something else, an uneasy peace. They shared the small space, the hum of the heater the only sound between them. At one point, Mara caught him watching her, his gaze softer than before. "You could have left me back there," she said. "Why didn't you?" Julian looked away, his voice low. "Because when you whispered to me, it reminded me what it feels like to trust someone again." The words hung in the air, quiet and real, and neither of them dared to break the silence. Julian pushed open the door to the small apartment, letting Mara step in first. It wasn't at all what she expected from a man like him. No marble floors, no city views, no trace of the billionaire image she'd seen on magazine covers. Just a clean, quiet space with warm lighting, and a couch that had clearly been there for years. She turned slowly, her voice low. "This doesn't look like you." Julian half smiled, locking the door behind them. "That's the point. It's the one place no one connects to me." His tone was calm, but his eyes said otherwise. He was still watching every shadow. Mara sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together to hide how badly they shook. "You really think they'd come after me?" she asked. Julian took off his jacket, folding it neatly on the armrest. "If they saw you warning me, yes." His honesty was brutal, but it made her trust him more. "I don't understand," she murmured. "I'm nobody." He paused, meeting her gaze. "You're the reason I'm still alive. That makes you somebody to them." Silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator. Julian poured them both a glass of water and handed one to her. "You haven't asked why they want me dead," he said. Mara hesitated, unsure if she wanted to know. "I figured if it's bad enough to kill over, it's better I don't," she replied. That made him smile faintly. "Maybe you're smarter than most people I know." Then, for the first time, he sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. He explained everything in short sentences, his voice calm but weighted with truth. Corruption in his company, money stolen under his nose, evidence he'd gathered quietly. "I thought I had more time," he said, "but they must have found out." Mara listened, the shock slowly giving way to sympathy. "You tried to do the right thing," she said softly, "and they tried to silence you for it." Julian looked at her, eyes steady. "Yeah, but they didn't plan on you. It wasn't flirtation, just quiet gratitude." Still, it made her heart trip over itself. The hours passed slowly. Julian worked at his laptop, sending encrypted files while Mara sat by the window, staring at the dark skyline. The city felt far away now, like another life. "Do you ever get used to being scared?" she asked. He looked up from the screen, thinking. "No, you just learn to live with it," he said. "Fear reminds you that what you're protecting matters." She didn't respond, but that line stayed with her. By midnight, exhaustion hit them both. Mara pulled the blanket from the couch, but Julian stopped her gently. "Take the bed," he said. "You've had enough for one night." She shook her head, embarrassed. "I'll be fine here." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "At least, lock the door," he said quietly. When she looked up, his expression wasn't one of command, it was worry. The kind that came from someone who wasn't used to caring but couldn't stop himself. When she finally lay down, she couldn't sleep. Every sound in the building made her tense, but beneath it all she kept replaying the same memory. The way he'd grabbed her hand back at the hotel, the certainty in his eyes. There had been fear, yes, but also something else. Trust, real, raw, unexpected trust. And as she drifted between exhaustion and unease, Mara realized the most dangerous part of that night wasn't what she'd heard. It was the feeling growing between them, quiet and undeniable. Morning sunlight leaked through the blinds, landing across the small table where Julian sat. His laptop open, Mara woke to the smell of coffee and the faint hum of his typing. She blinked, still half asleep, until she noticed his expression. Tense, unreadable. "What's wrong?" she asked. He turned the screen toward her. There it was, the headline. Crosswell scandal. CEO flees Gala after mysterious warning. Her stomach dropped as she saw her own blurred image next to his. "They know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They know it was me." Julian's jaw tightened as he read through the article. "Someone leaked it from inside," he said. "Probably one of the same people who set up the toast." Mara's pulse quickened. "What does this mean for you?" He exhaled slowly. "It means they'll use this to destroy me before the truth comes out." His tone was calm, but his eyes told a different story. He wasn't worried about himself. He was worried about her. "They'll go after you now. You're the only proof I didn't imagine all of this." Mara felt her chest tighten, the panic rising again. "Then I'll tell them what I heard," she said. "I'll go to the police." Julian shook his head immediately. "They'll twist it. They'll say you were paid to lie." He stood and began pacing, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand how deep this goes." She watched him for a moment, seeing not just the CEO everyone admired, but a man who was breaking under the weight of too many secrets. "Then what do we do?" she asked softly. Julian stopped pacing and looked at her, the exhaustion in his face softened by something warmer. "We stay quiet for now," he said. "I have people I trust who can help, but I need time." Mara nodded, though her fear didn't fade. "I didn't mean to ruin your life," she whispered. Julian's voice dropped lower, gentler. "You didn't ruin anything. You saved me." Their eyes met for a long moment, and the silence between them felt charged, like the first spark of something that neither of them wanted to name yet. The day passed in uneasy quiet. Mara tried to distract herself by cleaning up the small apartment, anything to escape the weight of the headlines. Julian barely spoke, switching between phone calls and silence. By late afternoon, she finally said, "You don't have to protect me, you know." He looked up from his screen, surprised. "I'm not doing this out of guilt," he said softly. "I'm doing it because I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't warned me." His voice cracked slightly. He wasn't used to admitting fear. She sat down across from him, folding her hands to keep from fidgeting. "You talk like someone who's always in control," she said. "But tonight you looked—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Human." That made him laugh. A small, tired sound that warmed the air between them. "I forget how that feels sometimes," he admitted. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was grounding. Two strangers somehow sharing the same heartbeat for a few quiet seconds. Later that evening, as rain started tapping against the window, Mara told him things she hadn't told anyone. About her 2 jobs, her tiny apartment, her mother's hospital bills that never stopped coming. "I'm not brave," she said. "I just couldn't watch someone die." Julian leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "That's the definition of brave," he said. "Doing something when you're scared out of your mind." His sincerity disarmed her. For once, his words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded real. Julian hesitated before speaking again. "You remind me of someone I used to be," he said quietly. "Before money, before all of this." His tone carried a kind of regret that caught her off guard. "What happened to him?" she asked. He gave a small, sad smile. He started believing that feelings made him weak. Mara's eyes softened. "Maybe that's how you survive, but it's not how you live." He met her gaze and didn't look away. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Truth, trust, maybe even fate, and neither of them was ready to break it. The rain outside turned heavier, streaking down the windows like tiny rivers. Mara sat curled up on the couch with one of Julian's hoodies draped around her shoulders. It smelled faintly like his cologne, clean, calm, safe. She watched him from across the room as he stood by the window, phone in hand, the light catching the tired lines around his eyes. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've barely slept." He glanced at her with a faint smirk. "Neither have you." It was true, but hearing it in his quiet tone made her smile for the first time in days. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the city, and Mara flinched instinctively. The sound brought her back to the night at the Gala. The noise, the panic, the fear that hadn't left her since. Julian noticed it immediately. Without saying a word, he crossed the room and knelt beside the couch, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You're safe here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His touch was warm, steady, nothing more, but it felt like a promise she desperately needed to believe in. She looked down at his hand, then back at his face, unsure what scared her more, the danger outside or the way her pulse reacted to him. "You're not used to people taking care of you, are you?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No one ever stays long enough to try." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he gave her hand a small squeeze before letting go, his expression caught somewhere between admiration and ache. Then, maybe it's time someone did. The rest of the night passed in quiet. They didn't talk much, just the soft hum of the heater and the rhythm of rain filling the silence. Every now and then their eyes met, and neither of them looked away. It wasn't romantic yet, not really. It was something simpler, comfort, the kind of connection born from chaos and survival. As the thunder faded and her eyelids grew heavy, Mara realized she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time since that night began, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. And Julian, still awake, watched over her until morning. Morning came quietly, but peace never lasted long in Julian's world. He was on a call when his expression shifted from calm to cold in a single breath. Mara watched him pace, tension creeping into every movement. "Are you sure?" he asked whoever was on the other end. His voice dropped lower. "No, don't send anything. I'll handle it." When he hung up, he didn't speak for several seconds. The air between them grew heavy. "They know where we are," he finally said, his tone grave. Mara felt her stomach twist. "How?" she whispered, panic rising again. Julian ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Someone I trusted must have told them. My team was supposed to be clean, but someone fed our location to the board." She stared at him, unable to process what that meant. "So, they're coming here." He met her eyes and gave a short, honest nod. "Sooner than we expected." The reality of his words hit hard. The safety they'd built overnight vanished like smoke. She stood up, pacing now, mirroring the same restless energy he'd shown moments ago. "Maybe I should go," she said suddenly. "They're after you, not me." Julian turned to her sharply, his tone firm. "No, you're the reason they're desperate. You're proof they tried to kill me. They'll do anything to erase that." The conviction in his voice left no room for argument. She sank back onto the couch, trembling, realizing there was no escaping this. Their fates were tied whether either of them liked it or not. Julian crouched down in front of her, his voice gentler now. "Mara, look at me." She hesitated before meeting his gaze. "You didn't do this. You saved my life," he said firmly. "Don't let them make you feel guilty for that." The sincerity in his words cracked something inside her. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "People like me don't get mixed up in worlds like yours without getting hurt." He shook his head. "Then I'll make sure you're the exception." A loud vibration startled them both, Julian's phone lighting up with an unknown number. He silenced it immediately, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "They're getting closer," he muttered. "They wouldn't be calling if they didn't already know." Mara's heart raced, and before she realized it, Julian was standing close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Pack a bag," he said. "Only what you need, we're leaving." His tone left no room for debate. She nodded, fighting the fear clawing at her chest. As she moved through the small apartment, stuffing a few clothes into a duffel, her thoughts spun in chaos. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that she should never have gotten involved. But every time she looked at him, she couldn't regret it. Julian wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was human, vulnerable, and trying to protect her at all costs. That realization both scared and comforted her. It made her heart ache in a way danger never had. Minutes later, they stood by the door, ready to disappear again. "Do you trust me?" he asked quietly, his hand already on the handle. Mara hesitated, her voice barely audible. "I don't even trust myself right now." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said he understood. "Then trust that I'll get us through this." For the first time, she did. Not because he was powerful, but because he looked at her like someone worth saving. And that, more than anything, made her want to believe. The next few hours felt like a blur. Julian drove through back roads and side streets, never taking the same route twice. Mara sat beside him, clutching her bag as city lights gave way to open highway. Neither spoke much. The silence between them said enough. Every time headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, her pulse spiked. "You think they're following us?" she asked finally. Julian's voice was steady but distant. "Not yet, but they will." There was something in his tone that scared her more than the idea of being chased. He sounded like a man who'd run before. They stopped just before sunrise at a small rental cabin by a frozen lake. Julian parked behind the building, covering the car with a tarp, before checking the perimeter twice. "You've done this before," Mara said quietly, watching him move with precision. He gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You learn fast when people start putting prices on your head." The attempt at humor fell flat, but it made her exhale anyway. She wasn't sure if she was laughing or panicking anymore. Maybe both. Inside, Julian spread papers and files across the table, his laptop flickering under dim light. "I've been tracking their transactions for weeks," he explained. "Shell companies, offshore accounts. It's all tied to 2 board members. If I can get this to my lawyer, it's over for them." Mara frowned, rubbing her arms against the cold. "So why haven't you?" He paused, looking at her. "Because I didn't have enough to prove who ordered the hit, until you showed up." The words made her breath hitch. "So I'm your evidence?" she asked. Julian's gaze softened. "You're the reason I'm still here." They worked side by side for hours, piecing together every detail. Mara wasn't trained for this, but she listened, asked questions, learned. The more she understood, the more she realized just how deep the corruption went. When Julian explained one of the forged signatures, she leaned in, pointing out a small pattern he'd missed. "You've got a good eye," he said. "Guess I've had to pay attention to survive," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. It made him smile for real this time. Tired, but genuine. At one point, Mara's hand brushed against his as they reached for the same paper. It was an accident, but neither of them moved right away. The warmth lingered just long enough for both of them to notice. She cleared her throat and pulled back. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Don't be," he said softly. His voice carried more emotion than he intended, and for a heartbeat, the danger outside didn't exist. Just the two of them, sitting too close, surrounded by secrets. By evening, exhaustion caught up with them. Julian stood by the window watching the snow fall, while Mara sat on the couch trying to fight off sleep. "You should rest," he said. "We'll need clear heads tomorrow." She shook her head, forcing a smile. "You say that like you'll actually sleep." He glanced back, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Maybe not, but I'll feel better knowing you can." It wasn't a confession, but it sounded dangerously close to one. When she finally lay down, Julian stayed by the window, keeping watch. The world outside was silent, but his mind wasn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. The fear, the strength, the way she looked at him like he was more than the man the world painted him to be. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but she was no longer just part of his plan. She was the reason he still had one. They'd been safe for 2 quiet days, long enough for Mara to almost believe the worst had passed. But peace never lasted long around Julian. That morning, while she was brewing coffee, he received an encrypted message on his laptop. The color drained from his face. "They found us," he said. Mara froze mid-motion, her hands gripping the counter. "How?" Julian closed the laptop and grabbed his jacket. "Someone must have followed the trail from the last transfer. We have to move, now." The calm in his tone didn't hide the panic in his eyes. Within minutes, they were on the road again, but this time the silence felt different. Julian's focus was razor-sharp, every glance at the mirror loaded with tension. Mara noticed how tightly he gripped the steering wheel, how every movement screamed control, while fear pulsed just beneath the surface. "You're scaring me," she said quietly. He exhaled through his nose. "Good. Stay scared, it'll keep you alert." But when their eyes met, she saw something else there. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for her. The first gunshot came out of nowhere. A tire exploded, sending the car skidding off the icy road. Julian reacted instantly, steering them behind an abandoned gas station. "Get down!" he shouted, covering her as glass shattered across the dashboard. The sound was deafening, the world spinning in flashes of noise and smoke. Mara could barely breathe. When it finally went silent, Julian turned to her, checking for blood, his hands shaking. "You're okay," he said, voice breaking with relief. "You're okay." His words sounded more like a prayer than reassurance. They stayed hidden until help arrived. An ally of Julian's, a former security agent who owed him a favor. The danger had passed for now, but the fear didn't fade. Mara sat in the passenger seat of the new car, staring out at the snow as Julian spoke quietly on the phone. His hand brushed hers, just for a second. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even deliberate. But when he looked at her, something in his eyes said everything his words couldn't. He'd rather lose everything he built than lose her. And she finally understood. That was what truly scared him. Julian hadn't set foot in his company's headquarters in weeks. The world thought he'd vanished. Some said he fled the country, others claimed he was dead. But that was exactly what he wanted them to believe. "They're holding an emergency board meeting tomorrow," he told Mara that night, eyes fixed on his laptop. "They plan to appoint a new CEO, finalize the cover-up, and bury every trace of what happened." He looked up at her then, his voice lower. "That's when I walk back in." The confidence in his tone didn't hide the weight of what it might cost. Mara's chest tightened. "If you go back, they'll come after you again," she said, fear threading through every word. Julian smiled faintly, a tired smile that said he'd already accepted the risk. "They already tried once. I don't plan to give them a second chance." She wanted to argue, but deep down, she knew he couldn't run forever. The man she'd come to know wasn't built to hide. He was built to fight, to finish what he started. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. His brows lifted slightly. "No, you're not." "Try and stop me," she replied. They drove through the night, the city lights reappearing on the horizon like the return of an old ghost. Julian briefed her on every detail, how to move, what to say, who to avoid, but none of his careful planning could disguise the truth she saw in him. He was scared. Not of failure, not of death, of losing her. When they reached the building, Julian paused before stepping out of the car. "If anything goes wrong," he said, "you run." Mara shook her head. "Not without you." For the first time, he didn't argue. When Julian walked through the glass doors the next morning, the room froze. The board members stared, pale and speechless, as if they'd seen a ghost. He looked calm, composed, alive, and angrier than anyone had ever seen him. "I hear I've been replaced," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, and devastatingly confident. Behind the glass partition, Mara watched, her pulse racing, as his words echoed across the room. She wasn't just seeing a CEO reclaim his power, she was seeing the man she'd come to care for walk straight into danger, fearless, determined, and somehow completely hers. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Every eye was on Julian as he stood at the head of the long glass table, his posture calm but his gaze razor-sharp. "I heard you've been busy," he began, setting a thick folder down in front of him. "Forged contracts, missing funds, fabricated reports. Impressive work for amateurs." The tension in the room tightened like a noose. A few exchanged nervous glances, but one man, Gerald Vaughan, met his stare head-on. "You can't prove anything," he said coldly. Julian smiled faintly. "I already did." With a single gesture, Julian opened his laptop and turned the screen toward them. Every transaction, every account, every name. The evidence flashed across the monitor as gasps and curses filled the air. "And before you think about pulling another stunt like the Gala," he added, his voice like ice, "this conversation's being recorded and streamed to 3 separate law firms." Panic spread. Phones buzzed. People started to rise from their chairs. "Sit down," Julian ordered. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone freeze. From behind the glass, Mara watched with her heart in her throat. She'd wanted to believe he could win, but seeing him like this, commanding, unbreakable, sent a rush of pride through her she couldn't hide. He wasn't just defending his company, he was defending the truth. The same man who'd hidden behind power and profit now stood for something real. As security entered the room and began escorting 2 board members out, Julian's gaze flicked up and found hers. For a split second he smiled, the kind that said, "We did it." When it was over, the boardroom was empty except for him. He leaned against the table, exhaling slowly, the adrenaline catching up with him. Mara entered quietly, her heels soft against the marble. "You really did it," she said. "They'll never touch you again." Julian looked at her, a hint of exhaustion softening his expression. "Maybe, but they'll try." She took a small step closer. "Then I guess I'll just have to watch your back." The faint smile that curved his lips wasn't one of triumph. It was relief. For the first time, he wasn't standing alone. The next morning, the world was watching. Dozens of cameras pointed toward the stage at Crosswell Industries headquarters, the air thick with questions and anticipation. Julian stepped into the spotlight in a navy suit, calm as ever, though Mara could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He adjusted the microphone, letting the chatter fade. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady but full of quiet conviction. "Today isn't about power or profit. It's about truth." The room fell silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. He spoke for 10 minutes straight, outlining every lie, every theft, every betrayal. Names, dates, proof. And then, with a pause that carried more weight than any headline, he said, "Someone tried to silence me." But one voice stopped them. He turned slightly, his gaze finding Mara at the edge of the crowd. She didn't have money, power, or a reason to get involved, but she had courage. The cameras flashed as everyone turned toward her. Mara froze, every instinct screaming to run, but his eyes held her there, warm, sure, unshakable. Julian extended a hand toward her, inviting her onto the stage. The crowd murmured as she stepped forward, hesitant at first, then steady. When she reached him, he whispered, "You belong up here too." She gave a nervous laugh. "I clean floors, Julian, not stand in front of cameras." He smiled, his voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You cleaned up something a lot bigger than floors. You cleaned up this company." The audience erupted in applause, flashes going off like lightning, but for a moment it felt like it was only the 2 of them standing there. As the noise grew, Julian leaned closer, his tone low enough only she could hear. "You changed everything," he said. "Not just for me, for what this company's going to be." Mara met his gaze, tears welling in her eyes. "You didn't need me for that," she whispered. "I think I did," he replied, his expression softening into something she hadn't seen before. Peace. Cameras caught the moment, the small smile between them that spoke louder than any statement he'd made. In the middle of chaos, they'd found something rare. Truth, trust, and maybe the start of love. After the press conference, the world exploded with headlines and praise, but Julian wanted none of it. He slipped out the back entrance with Mara, away from the cameras into the quiet hum of the evening city. Neither spoke on the drive back. The silence between them said more than words could. For the first time in weeks, there was no running, no fear, just stillness. When they reached his private rooftop terrace, the city stretched around them in glittering peace. Julian loosened his tie and finally exhaled. "It's over," he said softly. Mara looked at him, her smile faint but full of relief. "You did it." He shook his head. "We did." Dinner was simple. Take-out in paper boxes, the kind of normalcy both of them had forgotten existed. They talked for hours, about her life, his regrets, and the strange twist of fate that brought them together. Between laughter and long pauses, something deeper formed, a connection no crisis could fake. At one point, Julian leaned closer, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "The moment you told me not to drink." Mara smiled shyly. "And you actually listened." He laughed quietly. "Best decision I ever made." The warmth in his voice left no doubt. He wasn't just talking about the champagne anymore. The city lights painted them in gold, the air cool and gentle. For the first time, Mara felt like she could breathe again. "So what happens now?" she asked, half teasing, half afraid of the answer. Julian tilted his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now we stop surviving and start living." His words made her chest tighten in the best way. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough. And as they sat under the skyline that had once felt so distant, both knew that whatever came next wouldn't just be a new beginning. It would be their beginning. Weeks passed quietly after that rooftop night, the world slowly returning to its rhythm, while Julian and Mara built one of their own. She started working in his company's community branch, far from boardrooms and cameras. He'd drop by under the excuse of checking progress, though everyone knew it wasn't about reports anymore. Every visit came with a coffee he never finished and a look that lingered too long. "You're terrible at pretending this is work," she teased once. Julian grinned. "And you're terrible at pretending you don't like it." For a moment, the walls that used to divide them simply didn't exist. Their connection deepened in quiet moments, the stolen glances during meetings, the late-night texts that started with business and ended with laughter. Julian had always believed emotions made people reckless, but with Mara, it felt different. She didn't make him weak. She made him real. And for Mara, he wasn't the billionaire on magazine covers anymore. He was the man who remembered how she took her coffee, who listened when no one else ever had. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was slower, softer, like a heartbeat, learning a new rhythm. One afternoon, they found themselves alone in the elevator, the air thick with unspoken tension. Julian turned to her, his voice low. "Do you ever think about that night?" Mara looked up, meeting his gaze. "Every day." Neither moved at first, but when the doors opened on their floor, neither stepped out. He reached for her hand, hesitant but certain, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. It was a small gesture, but it said everything, that this wasn't luck or chance. It was destiny catching up. When the elevator finally stopped again, she smiled faintly. "You know, you're supposed to let go before people see us." He laughed softly, not moving an inch. "Maybe I don't care anymore." And for once, he didn't. In the quiet hum of that elevator, surrounded by the world that once tried to destroy them, their story finally shifted. From survival to love. Not loud or dramatic, but in the kind of whisper that lingers forever. Just when things seemed steady, the past came knocking. It started with an envelope, torn, dirty, left on Mara's desk without a sender. Inside was a photo of her walking beside Julian, circled in red ink, with 3 words scribbled underneath. "You should have stayed quiet." Her heart stopped. For months she'd convinced herself the danger was over, that the whispers and shadows had faded. But evil never disappears. It just waits for the right moment. When Julian saw the photo, his expression changed completely. Gone was the calm, composed CEO. What replaced it was raw fear. He locked down the building within minutes, calling security, his voice sharp and commanding. But behind that control was panic. "They're trying to get to me through you," he said, pacing the room. "I should have known this would happen." Mara tried to steady her voice. "I'm not afraid." He turned to her, frustration and tenderness colliding. "You should be." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of her uneven breath. "Julian," she whispered, "I won't live scared again. Not after everything we fought for." For a moment she thought he might argue, but instead he pulled her close, holding her like he was afraid to let go. Later that night they sat together in his office, city lights glowing beyond the glass. "You once told me truth was worth any price." Mara said quietly. "Do you still believe that?" Julian's jaw tightened, eyes on the skyline. "I do," he murmured. "But I didn't realize the price would be you." It was the closest he'd come to saying what they both already knew. She reached over, her fingers brushing his hand. "You won't lose me," she said. "Not now." And somehow, despite the fear still lingering in the corners of the room, he believed her. Just before midnight, an alert came through security. One of the men from the original scheme had escaped custody. Julian looked at Mara, his decision instant. "We're not waiting for them to come to us." He called Mark, the same investigator who'd helped them once before, and gave one order: find him before he finds her. As he hung up, Mara caught the look in his eyes, a mix of rage and devotion that made her chest ache. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for sure. Julian Crosswell wasn't just protecting her life anymore, he was protecting his heart. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the final hearing began. Julian sat beside Mara, their hands brushing on the table between them. Months of fear, running and rebuilding had led to this, one last stand for the truth. Across the aisle, the men who had tried to destroy him sat stone-faced, pretending calm. But the evidence was airtight, and this time Julian wasn't fighting alone. Mara's testimony was quiet but powerful, every word laced with courage. When she finished, the prosecutor nodded in silent respect. She hadn't just survived the storm, she'd faced it head-on. When the verdict came, it felt unreal. Guilty. The word echoed through the room, and a wave of relief hit them both at once. Julian closed his eyes, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for years. Mara looked at him, tears welling, but he smiled, soft, grateful, and full of something deeper than victory. "It's over," she whispered. "Not yet," he said, taking her hand. "Not until I tell you what I've been trying to say since that night." She tilted her head, heart racing. "Then say it." He leaned closer, his voice low and certain. "You're my reason to stay." After the chaos of the trial, life slowed down again, almost strangely so. Julian invited her to his penthouse rooftop, the place where it had all begun months earlier. This time, there was no fear, no pretending, just the hum of the city and the sound of her laughter floating through the cool night air. "You ever think about how close we came to losing everything?" she asked, half smiling. "Every day," he admitted, "and it makes me realize I don't ever want to risk losing you again." It wasn't a grand confession. It was real, quiet, and perfect. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You told me not to drink that night," he murmured. "And I didn't, but I fell anyway." Mara laughed softly, eyes shining. "Fell?" "Yeah," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "For you." She didn't answer with words, just leaned in, closing the distance that had been building between them since the first whisper. Somewhere below them, the city kept moving, unaware that two broken souls had finally found peace. Love had started as fear, but ended as freedom. A year later, the city sparkled beneath them once more. On that same rooftop where everything began, Julian and Mara stood beneath strings of soft golden lights, exchanging vows that didn't need to be perfect, just true. There were no reporters, no champagne towers, only the quiet hum of New York and a handful of people who'd seen their journey from fear to forever. When he said, "I choose you, every day," she smiled through tears. "You already did," she whispered back, sealing the promise with a kiss that felt like closure and beginning all at once. In the months that followed, they launched the Ellis Foundation, named after her late father and dedicated to protecting women who dared to speak up. Mara led with empathy. Julian handled the business side, but he often said she was the heart of it all. "You turned survival into purpose," he told her during one of their first outreach events. She laughed, adjusting the mic with a mix of pride and disbelief. "You turned fear into faith," she replied. Together they built something larger than redemption. It was legacy. Years later, during an interview, a journalist asked Mara how their story began. She smiled, glancing toward Julian, who stood across the room playing with their daughter. "With a whisper," she said softly, "a warning that changed everything." The reporter chuckled. "And what did he think when he read it?" Julian turned, catching her eye with that same familiar warmth. "It wasn't the words," he said. "It was the courage behind them." Their lives had started in danger but ended in peace, proof that sometimes destiny speaks quietly, through fear, through touch, through love. And when it does, it never stops echoing. Sometimes one whisper can change an entire life. Mara didn't plan to be a hero. She just followed her heart, and in doing so saved his. But tell me, If you were in her place, would you have risked everything to warn a stranger, or would fear have kept you silent? Maybe courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet choice made in the middle of chaos. What part of this story touched you the most? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter here. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories that will touch your heart and remind you that love always finds a way even when it starts with fear.